The candles in the ballroom went out one by one, but Evelyn Ashworth did not wait to see the last flame die. She was already walking toward the door, her back straight, her chin high, while 300 guests whispered behind painted fans. Lord Edmund Whitmore had just told the entire room that their engagement was over. He had not asked her privately. He had not written her a letter. He had stood beside the string quartet, raised his glass, and announced that he was betrothed instead to Miss Louisa Pemberton, a woman with a larger dowry and a father who sat in Parliament. Evelyn did not cry. She did not scream. She simply set down her own glass of champagne on the nearest table, so gently that it made no sound at all, and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Every eye in the room followed her. Every eye except one pair, which watched her with far more interest than pity. Gideon Ravensworth, the Duke of Ravensworth, stood near the tall windows at the far end of the hall, a glass of wine untouched in his hand. He had not spoken to more than a dozen people that evening. He rarely did. Since his wife's death 3 years earlier, he attended society events only when duty demanded it, and he left as soon as politeness allowed. But something about the way Evelyn Ashworth walked out of that room, without a single tear, without a single word of protest, caught his attention in a way nothing had in a very long time. He watched the doors close behind her. He watched the whispers rise like smoke through the crowd. He watched Whitmore laugh with his new fiancée as if nothing shameful had happened at all. And then, without announcing it to anyone, without excusing himself from his hosts, Gideon set down his glass and walked toward the entrance hall. Outside, the night air was cold and sharp. Evelyn stood at the top of the townhouse steps, waiting for her family's carriage, her gloved hands folded tightly in front of her. She could still hear the music drifting faintly from the open windows above. She could still feel every eye that had watched her walk away. Her pride had carried her out of that room, but now, alone in the dark, she allowed herself one long, unsteady breath. Her carriage arrived. She climbed inside without waiting for the footman's hand, and the door shut behind her. As the wheels began to turn against the cobblestones, she pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window and closed her eyes. She did not notice, at first, the second carriage that pulled away from the curb only a few minutes later. It was black, drawn by 2 dark horses, with no crest visible on its doors. It followed at a careful distance, never too close, never too far. Inside it, Gideon sat with his arms crossed, staring out at the passing streets, unsure himself why he had left the party so suddenly, unsure why he felt compelled to see that a stranger reached her home safely. He told himself it was simple concern. A woman humiliated in public, alone at night, deserved someone to make certain she arrived home without trouble. That was all. It was the kind of thing any gentleman might do. He ignored the small voice in his mind that reminded him he had not left a party early in 3 years, not even for guests he actually knew. The road outside London was dark and uneven, lit only by the thin light of a half-moon. Evelyn's carriage moved steadily through the quiet streets, past rows of sleeping townhouses, until the buildings began to thin, and the road opened into the countryside where her family's estate waited. She lived just far enough outside the city that the journey took the better part of an hour, and for most of that hour, she stared out the window without truly seeing anything at all. She thought of the years she had spent preparing for a life with Edmund Whitmore. She thought of the promises he had made her, the future he had described in quiet evenings by the fire, and how easily he had erased all of it in front of strangers. She thought of her mother's reaction, waiting for her at home, and how she would have to explain what had happened before the gossip reached their door first. She did not think of the second carriage behind her. It was only when her own carriage lurched suddenly, throwing her forward against the seat, that she realized something was wrong. The wheels ground against the road with a terrible crack, and the entire carriage tilted hard to one side, before coming to a stop at an awkward angle. Evelyn gripped the edge of her seat, her heart pounding, as she heard the driver curse under his breath and climb down to inspect the damage. "My lady," the coachman called through the door, his voice tight with worry. "The wheel has broken. I am afraid we cannot continue until it is repaired." Evelyn opened the door herself and stepped down into the cold night air, careful of her long skirts. The road stretched empty in both directions, bordered by dark fields and the shapes of distant trees swaying in the wind. There was no house in sight, no light, nothing but the moon and the sound of her own breathing. "How long will it take to repair?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The coachman shook his head grimly, kneeling beside the broken wheel. "Longer than we should stay out here, my lady. I do not have the proper tools with me tonight." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. She had already survived one humiliation that evening. She refused to let this moment, standing alone on a dark road with a broken carriage, become another story whispered about in ballrooms. It was then that she heard the sound of horses approaching, slow and deliberate, and a second carriage came into view around the bend in the road. She stiffened, unsure whether to feel relief or alarm, and watched as it came to a stop a short distance away. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped down into the moonlight. She recognized him instantly. The Duke of Ravensworth. She had seen him only from a distance at the ball, standing near the windows, saying little, drawing attention simply by being the sort of man who avoided it. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice calm and even as he approached, "it seems your carriage has met with some trouble." Evelyn lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how frightened she had been only moments before. "It has, Your Grace. Though I assure you, we do not require assistance. My coachman will have it repaired shortly." Gideon glanced at the broken wheel, then at the empty road stretching in both directions, then at the thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, entirely unsuited for the cold night air. "Forgive me for saying so, my lady, but I do not believe that wheel will be repaired before dawn, and I do not think it wise for you to wait here in the cold until it is. I did not ask for your opinion, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "You did not, but I am offering it regardless." Evelyn's pride wanted to refuse him outright. She wanted to stand on that dark road all night, rather than accept help from a stranger, especially one who had watched her humiliation only an hour before. But the wind was growing colder, and she could see her own breath forming small clouds in the air, and somewhere beneath her pride was a practical mind that understood the danger of remaining stranded on an empty road after midnight. "You may take me as far as the nearest crossroads," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "From there, I will send word to my family." "As you wish." Gideon did not smile, did not gloat, did not treat her surrender as any kind of victory. He simply extended his hand toward his own carriage and waited for her to decide when she was ready. She instructed her coachman to remain with the broken carriage and send word ahead once it was repaired, then walked toward the Duke's carriage with as much dignity as she could manage. He offered his hand to help her step inside, and after only the briefest hesitation, she accepted it. The interior of his carriage was warm, lined with dark velvet, and smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Evelyn settled herself carefully on the seat across from him, keeping her eyes fixed on the small window rather than on the man across from her. For several long minutes neither of them spoke. The carriage rolled forward again, the horses' hooves striking a steady rhythm against the road, and the silence between them grew heavier with every passing mile. It was Gideon who finally broke it. "I am sorry for what happened to you this evening." Evelyn's eyes flicked toward him, surprised by the directness of his words. Most people would have avoided mentioning it entirely, choosing instead to pretend they had not witnessed her humiliation at all. "You need not apologize on his behalf, Your Grace. You did nothing wrong." "I am not apologizing on his behalf. I am simply saying that no one deserves to be treated the way you were treated tonight, regardless of the circumstances." She studied him carefully in the dim light of the carriage lamp, trying to understand what he wanted from her. She had heard the stories about the Duke of Ravensworth, whispered in drawing rooms and repeated at every gathering she had ever attended. He had married for love, a rare thing among men of his rank, and had lost his wife to illness only a few years into their marriage. Since then, he had withdrawn almost entirely from society, appearing only when obligation required it, and disappearing again as soon as he was able. "You did not have to follow me tonight," she said quietly. "I would have managed on my own." "I have no doubt you would have," he replied. "You walked out of that ballroom without a single tear. I have rarely seen anyone show that kind of composure under such circumstances." Evelyn looked away, unwilling to let him see how close she had come to breaking down the moment she stepped outside. "Composure is easier to maintain than people believe, Your Grace. It is simply a matter of deciding what you will allow others to see." "And what do you allow others to see, Lady Ashworth?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment she did not answer, watching the dark countryside pass by outside the window. "Only what is necessary," she said finally. "Nothing more." Gideon nodded slowly, as though her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "I understand that better than you might think." The carriage rolled on through the darkness, carrying them both toward her family's estate, and though neither of them spoke again for the rest of the journey, something had shifted in the quiet space between them. Evelyn found herself glancing at him more than once, studying the sharp lines of his face in the lamplight, wondering what kind of man chose to leave a party unannounced, simply to ensure a stranger reached home safely. When the carriage finally slowed before the gates of her family's estate, Gideon stepped down first and offered his hand to help her out, just as he had before. Evelyn hesitated at the bottom of the steps, unsure of what to say to a man who had shown her more genuine kindness in one evening than her former betrothed had shown her in 2 years. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, "for your assistance tonight." "It was no trouble at all, Lady Ashworth." He inclined his head politely, though his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than propriety strictly required. "I hope the rest of your evening brings you some peace." She watched him climb back into his carriage and disappear down the dark road before she finally turned toward the house, where a single lamp still burned in the front window, waiting for her return. As she walked up the steps, she found herself thinking not of Edmund Whitmore's betrayal, but of the quiet, steady voice of a man she barely knew, and the strange comfort of a carriage that had followed her into the night for no reason she could fully explain. Margaret Ashworth slammed the morning newspaper down on the breakfast table so hard that the teacups rattled against their saucers. "Evelyn, explain this to me right now." Evelyn set down her toast, her stomach tightening as she reached for the paper. There, printed in bold letters across the society column, was a story claiming that Lady Evelyn Ashworth had been seen riding alone at night in the private carriage of the Duke of Ravensworth, mere hours after her public humiliation at the hands of Lord Whitmore. The article did not accuse her outright of impropriety, but it did not need to. The suggestion alone was enough to destroy whatever remained of her reputation. "My carriage broke down," Evelyn said carefully, keeping her voice level even as her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. "The Duke offered assistance. Nothing more happened between us, Mother. You must believe me." "It does not matter what actually happened," Margaret snapped, pacing the length of the dining room with the newspaper still clutched in her fist. "It only matters what people believe happened, and right now, all of London believes you left one engagement only to throw yourself at a duke the very same night." Evelyn stood from her chair, her appetite gone entirely. "I did nothing wrong. I know that. You know that. But knowledge means nothing against gossip, Evelyn. You were already vulnerable after what Whitmore did to you last night. This story will finish what he started." Her father, Colonel Ashworth, had said little since the argument began, sitting quietly at the head of the table with his newspaper folded beside his plate. Now he finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with concern. "Your mother is right, Evelyn. Whatever happened between you and the Duke, innocent or not, cannot happen again. Not until this story has faded from people's memory."
"And how long will that take?"
Evelyn asked, though she already suspected the answer. In a society that thrived on scandal, a story like this one could follow a woman for years, whispered behind fans at every gathering she attended for the rest of her life. Neither of her parents answered her question, because neither of them truly knew. Evelyn spent the rest of that day in her room, staring out the window at the gardens below, replaying every moment of the previous night in her mind. She thought of the calm, steady voice of the Duke as he apologized for something that was not his fault. She thought of the quiet dignity he had shown her, so different from the cruelty Whitmore had displayed in front of hundreds of witnesses. And yet now, that single act of kindness had become another weapon used against her. She did not know, sitting alone in her room, that the same story had reached the Duke's household that morning as well. Gideon read the article twice before setting it down on his desk, his jaw tight with quiet anger. He had expected some gossip after helping a stranded woman on a dark road, but he had not expected it to be twisted into something so deliberately damaging. He suspected, though he could not yet prove it, that the story had not originated from an innocent witness at all. His suspicion was confirmed later that same afternoon, when his old friend and steward, Henry Caldwell, arrived at his study with troubling news. "I made some inquiries this morning, Your Grace," Henry said, closing the study door behind him. The story did not come from a servant or a passing traveler, as the paper implies. It came from someone close to Lord Whitmore himself. A man named Pierce, one of Whitmore's regular companions, was seen speaking with the newspaper's editor only hours before the article was printed. Gideon's expression darkened. "Whitmore is spreading this himself." "It would appear so, Your Grace, though I cannot say for certain what his motive might be." Gideon rose from his desk and walked toward the window, staring out at the gray afternoon sky. He did not know Evelyn Ashworth well, had spoken to her only once, for less than an hour, and yet something about watching her reputation deliberately destroyed by a man who had already humiliated her once filled him with an anger he had not felt in a very long time. "His motive is simple enough," Gideon said finally. "He wishes to ensure that no one questions his decision to abandon her. If he can convince society that she was never worthy of him in the first place, no one will question his own conduct." Henry frowned. That seems a cruel way to protect his own reputation. Cruelty has never troubled men like Whitmore, so long as it serves their purposes. Gideon turned back toward his friend, his expression grim but resolved. "I will not allow an innocent woman to be destroyed, simply because I offered her a ride home on a cold night. What do you intend to do, Your Grace?" Gideon did not answer immediately. He was not a man who acted rashly, and he understood that any misstep on his part could make Evelyn's situation worse, rather than better. But he also understood that remaining silent, allowing the lie to spread unchallenged, would accomplish nothing at all. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn faced her own difficult decision. Her closest friend, Charlotte Bennet, arrived at the Ashworth estate that same evening, her face full of concern as she was shown into the drawing room. "I came as soon as I heard," Charlotte said, taking Evelyn's hands in her own. "Is it true? Did the Duke of Ravensworth truly help you last night?" "It is true," Evelyn admitted. "My carriage broke down on the road home. He offered assistance, nothing more. But now half of London believes something entirely different happened between us." Charlotte's expression softened with sympathy, though there was also a trace of curiosity she could not quite hide. "What is he like? The Duke, I mean. I have heard so many stories about him, but no one truly seems to know him." Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "He is quiet, thoughtful. He apologized for what Whitmore did to me, even though he had no reason to feel responsible for another man's cruelty. I have never met anyone quite like him." "You sound as though you admire him." "I admire his kindness," Evelyn corrected quickly. "Nothing more. I have no intention of allowing myself to become entangled with another man so soon after what happened with Edmund, especially not a man whose name is already being connected to mine in the newspapers." Charlotte squeezed her friend's hands gently. "Whatever happens, Evelyn, you must not let Whitmore win. He humiliated you publicly, and now he is trying to ruin what little reputation you have left. You cannot allow him to succeed." "I do not intend to," Evelyn said, though privately she was not certain how she could possibly stop him. She was a woman without power in a society built entirely around the opinions of powerful men, and Whitmore held far more influence than she ever would. Over the following days, the gossip only grew worse. Evelyn found herself excluded from invitations she would once have received without question. Families who had once welcomed her into their homes now offered polite but distant excuses whenever her name was mentioned. Even at church, she noticed the way certain women turned their heads away as she passed, whispering behind gloved hands the moment they believed she was out of hearing. Her mother grew increasingly desperate, suggesting that Evelyn should leave London entirely for a time, perhaps stay with distant relatives in the countryside until the scandal faded from memory. Her father said little, but Evelyn could see the worry etched into his face every time he looked at her, as though he feared she might never recover her place in society at all. It was nearly a week after the broken carriage incident when Evelyn received an unexpected letter, delivered not by the postal service but by a private messenger dressed in fine livery. She recognized the seal immediately, though she had never seen it before, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke it open. The letter was brief, written in a steady, careful hand. "Lady Ashworth, I have learned the source of the recent article concerning our encounter on the road. I do not believe you should suffer alone for a story that was deliberately manufactured to harm you. I intend to address this matter directly, though I did not wish to act without first informing you of my intentions. If you would prefer that I remain uninvolved, I will respect your wishes entirely, but I could not, in good conscience, allow this injustice to continue unchallenged. Yours in sincere respect, Gideon Ravensworth." Evelyn read the letter 3 times before setting it down on her writing desk, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. Part of her wanted desperately for someone, anyone, to defend her against the lies being spread throughout London. But another part of her, the part shaped by years of careful caution, worried that any further involvement with the Duke would only deepen the scandal rather than resolve it. She spent the rest of that evening composing and discarding several replies, unsure of what to say to a man who had offered her nothing but kindness, while the rest of society turned against her. In the end, she wrote only a short response, thanking him for his concern but urging him to consider carefully before taking any action that might draw further attention to either of them. She did not know, as she sealed her letter and sent it off into the night, that Gideon had already decided what he intended to do, regardless of her answer. He had spent too many years remaining silent while the world moved around him, avoiding attention, avoiding involvement, protecting himself from further loss by refusing to feel anything at all. But watching an innocent woman suffer for a lie told by a cruel and cowardly man had stirred something in him that he had thought long buried. For the first time in 3 years, Gideon Ravensworth intended to step fully back into the world he had spent so long avoiding, and he intended to do it for her sake. The garden party at Lady Beaumont's estate had barely begun, when Evelyn realized she should never have come. She stood near the edge of the terrace, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in her hands, watching as small clusters of guests shifted away from her the moment she approached. A woman she had known since childhood offered her a tight, polite smile before turning quickly to speak with someone else. A group of young ladies near the rose garden lowered their voices to whispers the instant they noticed her nearby. Evelyn kept her expression carefully composed, refusing to let anyone see how deeply each small cruelty cut into her. "You should not have come today," Charlotte murmured beside her, glancing nervously around the garden. "Not with the way people have been talking. If I hide myself away every time someone whispers about me, I will never leave my house again," Evelyn replied quietly. "I have done nothing wrong, Charlotte. I refuse to behave as though I have." But her resolve was tested only a few minutes later, when Edmund Whitmore himself arrived at the party, his new fiancée Louisa Pemberton on his arm, both of them smiling as though nothing shameful had ever happened between him and Evelyn at all. The moment Whitmore noticed her standing near the terrace, his smile widened with a cruelty that made Evelyn's stomach turn. "Lady Ashworth," he said, approaching with Louisa still clinging to his arm. "How pleasant to see you out in society again. I confess I feared you might have retreated to the countryside after recent events." "I have no reason to retreat anywhere, Lord Whitmore," Evelyn replied evenly, though her heart pounded with barely controlled anger. "I have done nothing that requires hiding." "Of course not," Whitmore said, though his tone carried unmistakable mockery. "Riding alone at night in a duke's private carriage is perfectly respectable behavior, I am certain." Several guests nearby turned to listen, and Evelyn felt her face grow warm with humiliation as their eyes settled on her. "My carriage broke down on the road. The Duke offered assistance out of simple decency, nothing more. I would think a gentleman would understand the difference between kindness and impropriety." "Perhaps," Whitmore said, "though I wonder if the Duke's motives were truly so innocent. Men of his rank rarely trouble themselves over strangers without some interest of their own." Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, though she was uncertain what words could possibly defend her against such calculated cruelty in front of so many witnesses. But before she could speak, a new voice cut through the tension gathering around them. "If you wish to discuss my motives, Lord Whitmore, I suggest you address them to me directly, rather than speculating about them in front of an audience." The entire garden seemed to fall silent as Gideon Ravensworth stepped onto the terrace, his expression calm but his eyes sharp with quiet warning. Evelyn stared at him in surprise, having had no idea he intended to attend Lady Beaumont's party at all. He had not attended a single society gathering in the 3 years since his wife's death, and his sudden appearance sent a ripple of astonished whispers through the crowd. Whitmore's confident smile faltered slightly as the Duke approached. "Your Grace, I did not realize you would be joining us today." "Clearly not," Gideon replied evenly, "or you might have chosen your words more carefully before I arrived. I meant no offense, Your Grace. I was simply concerned for Lady Ashworth's reputation, given the circumstances of your encounter." "Your concern would carry more weight, Lord Whitmore, if it were not you yourself who arranged for that encounter to be printed in the newspapers in the first place." Gideon's voice remained calm, but there was a hardness beneath it that made several guests nearby exchange uneasy glances. "I have learned a great deal about the source of that article this past week. I would advise you to consider carefully whether you wish me to share what I have learned in front of your new fiancée and her family." Whitmore's face paled visibly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. "I do not know what you are suggesting, Your Grace." "I believe you understand perfectly well." Gideon's gaze did not waver. "Lady Ashworth has suffered enough humiliation because of your actions. I suggest you find some measure of decency before you cause her further harm." For a long, tense moment, no one in the garden spoke. Louisa Pemberton glanced nervously between her fiancé and the Duke, clearly sensing that something significant had passed between the two men, though she did not understand its full meaning. Whitmore's jaw tightened with barely restrained anger, but he said nothing further, offering only a stiff bow before leading Louisa away toward the far side of the garden. Evelyn stood frozen for a moment, uncertain how to respond to what had just happened. She had not asked for the Duke's intervention, had in fact urged him against it in her letter, and yet here he was, having risked his own reputation and years of careful isolation to defend her honor in front of half of London's most influential families. "You should not have done that," she said quietly, once Whitmore was out of earshot. "Perhaps not," Gideon admitted, "but I found I could not stand by and watch him humiliate you a second time without saying something. Everyone will be talking about this by tomorrow morning." "They already were, Lady Ashworth. I merely gave them something more accurate to discuss." Despite herself, Evelyn felt the corner of her mouth lift slightly, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself in nearly a week. "You have a strange way of trying to help someone, Your Grace." "I have been told that before," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something close to warmth in his expression. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Beaumont herself, eager to greet the Duke, and clearly delighted by the unexpected drama that had unfolded in her garden. Evelyn used the distraction to step back, giving Gideon space to be pulled into polite conversation with their hostess, though she noticed he glanced toward her more than once throughout the remainder of the afternoon. Later that evening, back in the quiet of her own room, Evelyn found herself thinking not of Whitmore's cruelty, nor of the whispers that had followed her throughout the garden party, but of the calm certainty in Gideon's voice as he had defended her in front of everyone. She had spent years believing that composure and silence were her only true weapons against a society built on gossip and judgment. But watching the Duke step forward so deliberately, risking his own carefully protected reputation for her sake, she began to wonder whether silence was truly the only way to fight back after all. Her mother, upon hearing what had happened at the party, was torn between relief and fresh worry. "The Duke defending you publicly will either save your reputation entirely," Margaret said that night, pacing the length of Evelyn's bedroom, "or it will destroy what remains of it completely. There will be no middle outcome now, Evelyn. Society will decide, once and for all, whether to believe Whitmore's lies or the Duke's word. Then I suppose we shall see which one they choose to believe," Evelyn replied quietly, though privately she found herself hoping, for reasons she could not fully explain, that she would have the chance to speak with the Duke again soon. She did not have to wait long. 2 days later, an invitation arrived at the Ashworth estate, sealed with the same crest she now recognized instantly. The Duke of Ravensworth was hosting a small gathering at his estate the following week, and Lady Evelyn Ashworth, along with her family, was cordially invited to attend. Evelyn stared at the invitation for a long time before finally setting it aside, uncertain whether accepting would help repair her reputation or destroy it entirely. But beneath her uncertainty was something else entirely, a small flicker of anticipation she had not expected to feel again so soon after her heart had been so publicly broken. Whatever waited for her at Ravensworth's estate, she found herself unable to refuse the invitation. The gates of Ravensworth Hall stood open long before Evelyn's carriage arrived, and even from a distance, she could see that the estate was far grander than she had imagined. Tall stone towers rose above rows of ancient oak trees, and the long gravel drive curved gently past gardens that, despite the season, had clearly once been tended with great care. "It is beautiful," Evelyn murmured, more to herself than to her mother, who sat beside her in tense silence, still uncertain whether accepting this invitation had been wise. "Beautiful or not," Margaret replied quietly, "we must be careful tonight, Evelyn. One more misstep, and there will be no recovering your place in society." Evelyn said nothing in response, though she understood her mother's warning better than anyone. She had spent the days since the garden party turning the Duke's actions over in her mind, trying to understand why a man so determined to avoid society would risk everything to defend a woman he barely knew. She still did not have an answer, but she found herself eager to discover one. The carriage came to a stop before the wide stone steps of the entrance, where Gideon himself waited to greet his guests, a small gesture that surprised Evelyn considerably. Most men of his rank would have left such duties to servants. "Lady Ashworth." "Mrs. Ashworth," he bowed politely as they stepped down from the carriage, "I am glad you decided to come." "Your invitation was rather difficult to refuse, Your Grace," Evelyn replied, glancing briefly at the grand estate behind him, "though I confess I was surprised to receive it." "I thought it might be helpful," he said simply, "for society to see that our acquaintance was nothing more than what it truly was, an act of simple assistance, followed by genuine concern for your well-being." Evelyn studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of hidden motive, but found only quiet sincerity. Whatever his reasons, they seemed as honest as everything else she had witnessed of his character so far. The evening unfolded far more comfortably than Evelyn had expected. The gathering was small, no more than a dozen guests, all of them families with reputations solid enough that their presence alongside her would not draw further scandal. Conversation flowed easily over dinner, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Evelyn found herself laughing genuinely at something said across the table, rather than simply maintaining the careful composure she had grown so accustomed to wearing in public. After dinner, as the other guests gathered in the drawing room for cards and quiet conversation, Gideon found a moment to speak with Evelyn alone, guiding her toward a quiet corridor lined with tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens. "You seem more at ease tonight," he observed. "I am surprised to admit that I am," Evelyn said. I did not expect to enjoy myself here, given everything that has happened these past 2 weeks. I am glad, regardless of the reason. Gideon paused beside one of the windows, his gaze drifting toward the gardens outside. I have not hosted an evening like this in a very long time. Not since your wife passed? Evelyn asked gently, immediately wondering if the question had been too forward, but Gideon did not seem offended by it. Not since then, no, he admitted. After she died, I found it easier to avoid gatherings entirely, rather than face the constant reminders of what I had lost. Society expects a certain performance of grief and recovery, and I found I had no interest in performing either. That must have been a very lonely way to live. It was, he said quietly, though I did not fully realize how lonely until recently. Evelyn understood, without needing further explanation, that he was speaking of the past few weeks, of the sudden and unexpected reason he had found to re-enter a world he had spent years deliberately avoiding. Her heart quickened slightly at the implication, though she was careful not to let it show too openly. I owe you a great debt, Your Grace, she said instead, for everything you have done these past 2 weeks. I do not know how I will ever properly repay your kindness. You owe me nothing, Gideon replied firmly. I did not defend you out of obligation, Lady Ashworth. I did it because I could not stand by and watch a man like Whitmore destroy someone who deserved none of the cruelty he inflicted upon her. Even so, Evelyn said softly, few men would have risked their own reputation so completely for a stranger. You are no longer a stranger to me, Gideon said, his voice quieter now, more careful. I find myself thinking of our conversation on the road more often than I probably should. Evelyn's breath caught slightly at the admission, though she said nothing in response, uncertain how to answer honestly without revealing more than she was ready to share. The silence between them stretched on, comfortable rather than tense, until the sound of approaching footsteps signaled the return of other guests, and the moment passed without further words spoken. Later that night, as Evelyn's carriage carried her home through the dark countryside, she found herself replaying the conversation over and over in her mind, searching for meaning in every word he had spoken. She had come to Ravensworth Hall uncertain of the Duke's true intentions, and she left it with far more questions than answers, though none of them frightened her the way she might have expected. Meanwhile, in a private club in the heart of London, Edmund Whitmore sat across a card table from his old companion, Lord Pierce, his expression tight with barely controlled frustration. The Duke has made himself my enemy, Whitmore muttered, tossing his cards onto the table without finishing the hand. First he humiliates me in front of half of London's finest families, and now he hosts private gatherings for Lady Ashworth, as though nothing improper ever occurred between them at all. You brought this upon yourself, Pierce replied, unsympathetic. You should never have let word of your difficulties reach the newspapers in the first place. That article was meant to protect your reputation, not draw the Duke's attention directly onto you. Whitmore's expression darkened further at the mention of his difficulties, the very debts he had worked so hard to conceal from society, by abandoning Evelyn for Louisa Pemberton's far larger fortune. The Duke knows something. I could see it in his eyes at that garden party. If he discovers the full truth of my situation, I will be ruined far more thoroughly than any broken engagement could ever accomplish. Then perhaps, Pierce said carefully, it is time to ensure he never has the chance to learn anything further. Whitmore looked up sharply at his companion's tone, understanding the implication behind his words. What are you suggesting? Only that a man in your position cannot afford to leave loose threads unattended, Pierce said quietly. Lady Ashworth's reputation was only the beginning. If the Duke continues to pursue this matter, you may need to ensure that his own reputation suffers just as thoroughly as hers. Whitmore said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the scattered cards on the table between them, his mind already turning toward darker possibilities than he had previously considered. Whatever kindness the Duke had shown Evelyn Ashworth, whatever growing affection seemed to be forming between them, Whitmore intended to ensure that it brought them nothing but further ruin. A folded piece of paper slipped from beneath the drawing-room door just after midnight, and Evelyn nearly missed it entirely as she crossed the room to extinguish the last candle. She bent to retrieve it, expecting perhaps a note from a servant, but the handwriting on the outside made her pause. She did not recognize it, and there was no name attached, only a single instruction written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. Read this before you trust the Duke any further. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. Inside were several lines describing a meeting between Lord Whitmore and a man named Pierce, along with mention of significant gambling debts owed by Whitmore to several disreputable creditors throughout London. The note claimed that Whitmore's abrupt engagement to Louisa Pemberton had nothing to do with love or advantage, and everything to do with the size of her father's fortune, which he desperately needed to settle debts that threatened to destroy him entirely. She read the note 3 times, her mind racing. If true, it meant that Whitmore had never truly cared for Louisa any more than he had cared for her. It meant his cruel public rejection had been nothing more than a calculated escape from financial ruin, dressed up as a romantic betrayal to spare his own pride. But why would someone deliver this information to her now, anonymously, in the middle of the night? She did not have long to wonder. The following morning she received an unexpected visit from Henry Caldwell, the Duke's steward, who arrived at the Ashworth estate with an urgent request that she meet privately with Gideon as soon as possible. "His Grace asked me to bring you this personally," Henry said, handing her a sealed letter, his expression grave. "He believes there may be danger involved, Lady Ashworth, and he did not wish to trust the matter to ordinary correspondence." Evelyn broke the seal immediately, her heart pounding as she read Gideon's careful handwriting. "Lady Ashworth, I have uncovered troubling information regarding Lord Whitmore's financial circumstances, and I believe he may be aware that I possess it. I fear he intends to take drastic measures to protect himself, and I do not wish for you to be caught unprepared should he attempt to involve you further in his schemes. Please come to Ravensworth Hall as soon as you are able. I would feel far better discussing this matter with you in person." Gideon. Evelyn wasted no time. Within the hour, she was in her carriage, traveling once again toward the Duke's estate, the anonymous note still folded carefully inside her glove. When she arrived, Gideon met her immediately in his private study, his expression tense in a way she had not seen before. "You received something as well," he said, before she had even fully closed the door behind her, noticing the paper she still carried. "An anonymous note, delivered last night," Evelyn confirmed, handing it to him. "It claims Whitmore's engagement to Louisa Pemberton was arranged entirely to settle gambling debts. Is this what you have discovered as well?" "It is," Gideon confirmed grimly, reading the note quickly before setting it down on his desk. "I have spent the past week making careful inquiries, and I have confirmed that Whitmore owes a substantial sum to several creditors, men who do not forgive debts easily, and who have already threatened consequences should he fail to pay what he owes. His engagement to Miss Pemberton was never about affection. It was about survival. Then everything he did to me," Evelyn said slowly, the full weight of the realization settling over her. "The public humiliation, the newspaper article, all of it was simply to protect his own financial secrets." "I believe so, yes." Gideon's expression darkened further. "And I believe he suspects that I have uncovered the truth. My steward received word this morning that a man matching Pierce's description was seen watching this estate late last night. I do not believe that was a coincidence." A cold unease settled over Evelyn as she considered the implications. "Do you believe we are in danger?" "I believe Whitmore is desperate enough to consider dangerous measures if he feels sufficiently cornered," Gideon admitted. "Desperate men rarely make careful decisions." Evelyn's mind raced through the possibilities, though she refused to allow fear to overtake her entirely. "Then we must act first, before he has the chance to cause further harm. If we can prove the truth of his debts publicly, his engagement to Miss Pemberton will collapse, and his ability to threaten either of us will collapse alongside it." Gideon studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of such a plan. It would mean confronting him directly and exposing his secrets in front of society, exactly as he attempted to do to you. "Are you prepared for what that might mean, should it not unfold exactly as we hope?" "I have already survived public humiliation once, Your Grace," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the fear still curling in her chest. "I would rather face it again, on my own terms, fighting for the truth, than continue living in fear of what Whitmore might do next." Gideon nodded slowly, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his features. "Then we will need proof. Firm evidence of his debts, something undeniable enough that society cannot dismiss it as mere rumor, the way they so easily dismissed the truth about your own innocence." Over the following days, Gideon's careful inquiries continued, aided quietly by Henry Caldwell, who possessed connections throughout London's financial circles that proved invaluable. Evelyn, for her part, reached out discreetly to Charlotte, whose family had business dealings that occasionally intersected with the same creditors Whitmore owed money to. Slowly, piece by piece, they gathered enough evidence to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Whitmore's sudden engagement had been motivated entirely by desperation rather than affection. But their efforts did not go unnoticed. Late one evening, as Evelyn walked alone through her family's garden, lost in thought over the growing evidence against Whitmore, she heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path behind her, far too heavy and deliberate to belong to a servant. She turned quickly, her heart pounding, and found herself facing a man she did not recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression cold and unfriendly in the dim evening light. "Lady Ashworth," the man said, his voice carrying a quiet menace that made the hair on her arms rise. "Lord Pierce sends his regards, and a warning. You and the Duke would be wise to abandon whatever investigation you have begun. Some secrets are safer left undisturbed." Evelyn forced herself to remain still, refusing to let the man see how frightened she truly was. "I do not respond well to threats delivered in dark gardens by men who refuse to give their names." The stranger's expression hardened. "Consider this your only warning, my lady. The next one may not be so polite." Before Evelyn could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows beyond the garden wall, leaving her standing alone, her heart racing, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. She hurried back inside immediately and sent word to Gideon that very night, describing everything that had happened. Gideon arrived at the Ashworth estate within the hour, his expression thunderous when he learned what had transpired. "This ends now," he said firmly. "I will not allow him to threaten you any further, whatever the cost to my own reputation." "What do you intend to do?" Evelyn asked, watching him carefully. "I intend to expose him completely, publicly, and immediately," Gideon said. "I have gathered enough evidence to prove his debts beyond question. Lady Beaumont is hosting another gathering in 3 days' time, one that both Whitmore and Miss Pemberton's family are certain to attend. I intend to present the truth there, in front of everyone, exactly as he once tried to destroy you." Evelyn felt a fresh wave of fear at the thought of such a public confrontation, but beneath that fear was something stronger, a fierce determination she had not fully recognized in herself before this entire ordeal began. "Then I will stand beside you when you do it," she said firmly. "I will not let you face this alone, not after everything you have done to defend me." Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing across his features despite the tension of the situation. "You do not have to involve yourself further, Evelyn. I would understand if you wish to remain safely removed from whatever consequences follow." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it, quiet and sincere, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, despite everything else weighing on her mind. "I have spent these past weeks watching you risk everything to defend my honor," she said softly. "I will not stand by silently while you do the same for the truth. Whatever happens at Lady Beaumont's gathering, we will face it together." Gideon reached for her hand then, his fingers closing gently around hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke at all, the quiet understanding between them saying far more than words ever could. Whatever danger awaited them in 3 days' time, whatever consequences might follow their decision to expose Whitmore's deception publicly, they would face it side by side, and somehow, that knowledge made the fear feel far more bearable than it had only moments before. The doors of Lady Beaumont's ballroom swung open, and Evelyn felt every eye in the room turn toward her the moment she stepped inside, exactly as they had on the night her engagement had ended so publicly weeks before. This time, however, she did not walk in alone. Gideon walked beside her, his hand steady at her back, his expression calm despite the enormous risk they were both about to take. "Are you certain you wish to go through with this?" he asked quietly, as they paused near the entrance, watching the crowd of London's finest families mingling beneath the glittering chandeliers. "I have never been more certain of anything," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Whitmore built his cruelty on lies. It is time the truth finally stood in its place." They found Whitmore near the center of the room, engaged in pleasant conversation with several members of Louisa Pemberton's family, his expression relaxed and confident, entirely unaware of what awaited him. Louisa stood at his side, radiant in a gown of pale blue silk, smiling warmly at whatever charming story he was currently telling. Gideon approached without hesitation, Evelyn beside him, and the conversation around Whitmore faded into uneasy silence as the small crowd noticed their arrival. "Lord Whitmore," Gideon said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering space, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "I believe there is something you have failed to share with your future family." Whitmore's confident smile faltered instantly, his eyes flicking nervously between Gideon and Evelyn. "Your Grace, I am not certain what you mean." "I mean," Gideon continued, withdrawing a small folder of documents from beneath his coat, "the substantial debts you currently owe to no fewer than 4 separate creditors throughout London, debts that have grown considerably over the past 2 years, and debts that I believe motivated your sudden engagement to Miss Pemberton far more than any genuine affection ever did." A murmur of shocked whispers rippled through the surrounding crowd. Louisa's smile vanished entirely, replaced by confusion and growing alarm as she looked up at her fiancé. Edmund, what is he talking about? He is spreading lies, Whitmore said quickly, though his voice carried none of its usual confidence. I do not know where he obtained such false information, but I assure you, Louisa, there is no truth to any of it. Is that so? Gideon opened the folder and withdrew a single document, holding it up for the growing crowd to see. This is a signed acknowledgement of debt, bearing your own signature, Lord Whitmore, dated only 4 months before you ended your engagement to Lady Ashworth. I have 3 more documents just like it, along with statements from creditors, confirming that you approached them repeatedly seeking extensions on payments you could not afford to make. Whitmore's face had gone pale, his eyes darting toward the crowd now watching him with open suspicion rather than polite interest. This is preposterous. I will not stand here and be accused of such things in front of everyone I know. Then perhaps you should explain, Louisa said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt. Why you told my father you had fallen in love with me the very same week you broke your engagement to Lady Ashworth. If these debts are truly fabricated as you claim. Whitmore had no answer for her, his mouth opening and closing without any sound emerging at all. The silence stretched on, heavy and damning, as more and more guests gathered around them, drawn by the growing scandal unfolding in the center of the ballroom. It was Evelyn who finally spoke, stepping forward calmly despite the racing of her heart. I do not say this to seek revenge, Lord Whitmore. I say it because I have spent weeks watching you allow the entire city to believe I had done something shameful, when the truth is that you humiliated me publicly simply to hide your own failures. I deserved better than the lies you told about me. And Miss Pemberton deserves better than the lies you are still telling now. Louisa's eyes filled with tears as she looked between Evelyn and Whitmore, the full weight of the deception finally settling over her. Without another word, she pulled her arm free from his grasp and turned toward her father, who had been listening to the entire exchange with a face rapidly reddening with anger. We are leaving, Louisa's father said sharply, guiding his daughter away from Whitmore, who stood frozen and humiliated in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the very society he had once tried so desperately to impress. Whitmore's gaze swept the room, searching for any remaining allies, but found only cold, judging stares from every direction. Even Pierce, who had been standing near the refreshment table throughout the confrontation, quietly slipped away into the crowd, unwilling to be associated any further with a man whose reputation had just collapsed so completely. You will regret this, Whitmore hissed quietly, glaring at Gideon and Evelyn as the crowd began to disperse around him, whispering excitedly about everything they had just witnessed. I regret nothing, Gideon replied evenly. You built your entire reputation on the suffering of others. It was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with you. Whitmore had no response left to give. He turned and left the ballroom without another word, his social standing, so carefully protected through cruelty and deception, utterly destroyed in the span of a few short minutes. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur for Evelyn, as guest after guest approached her with quiet apologies for their earlier coldness and expressions of genuine sympathy for everything she had endured. The very same women who had turned away from her at Lady Beaumont's garden party weeks before now sought her out eagerly, curious and impressed by the quiet strength she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. It was well past midnight before Evelyn finally found a quiet moment alone with Gideon, stepping out onto the same terrace where Whitmore had once mocked her so cruelly weeks earlier. The garden below was peaceful now, lit softly by lanterns hung among the trees, and the noise of the ballroom faded into a distant, pleasant hum behind them. It is strange, Evelyn said softly, gazing out over the moonlit garden, to think that everything began right here, on this very terrace, with him trying to destroy me, in front of everyone I knew. And now, Gideon said quietly, standing beside her, it ends here as well, with the truth finally standing in place of his lies. Evelyn turned to look at him, studying the calm, steady features that had become so familiar to her over these past difficult weeks. I do not know how I will ever properly thank you for everything you have done, Gideon. You risked your own reputation, your own carefully guarded peace, simply to defend someone you barely knew. I do not believe that is entirely true anymore, he said softly. I do not believe you are simply someone I barely know, not after everything we have faced together these past weeks. Evelyn's heart quickened at the warmth in his voice, at the quiet sincerity in his eyes as he studied her in the soft lantern light. No, she agreed quietly. I suppose I am not. Do you remember, Gideon continued, the night I first followed your carriage? I told myself it was simple concern, nothing more than any decent man would offer a stranger in need. But the truth is, Evelyn, I could not stop thinking about the way you walked out of that ballroom, with such quiet dignity, refusing to let anyone see you break, even after everything Whitmore had done to humiliate you. I had not felt drawn to anyone in that way in 3 years. I did not know what to make of it. Evelyn felt her breath catch slightly at his words, though she said nothing, waiting to hear what he intended to say next. I have spent these past weeks trying to convince myself that my interest in your well-being was nothing more than simple decency, Gideon continued, his voice growing quieter, more careful. But I no longer believe that is entirely true. I admire you, Evelyn. Not simply for the strength you showed that night, but for everything I have witnessed since. Your courage, your honesty, your refusal to let cruelty define who you are. Gideon, Evelyn began softly, uncertain what she intended to say, though her heart was racing with an emotion she had not expected to feel so soon after everything she had endured. I do not ask you to answer me tonight, he said gently, before she could finish. I understand that you have endured a great deal these past weeks, and I would never wish to rush you into any decision you are not ready to make. But I wanted you to know the truth of my feelings, regardless of what you choose to do with them. Evelyn studied his face carefully in the soft lantern light, searching for any trace of the calculated ambition or cruelty that had defined her previous engagement. She found none, only quiet, steady sincerity, the same quality that had drawn her to trust him from the very first night they had spoken on that dark, empty road. I do not need more time, Gideon, she said softly, surprising herself with the certainty in her own voice. I have spent these past weeks watching you defend me, support me, and stand beside me through every difficulty this ordeal has brought. I do not believe I could ask for a more genuine partner than the one standing before me now. Gideon's expression softened with quiet relief and unmistakable joy. Then may I ask you properly, Evelyn, rather than simply confessing my feelings in the dark like some nervous young man at his very first ball. Evelyn laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet night air. You may ask me however you wish, Gideon. He took her hand gently in his own, his eyes steady and full of quiet certainty. Lady Evelyn Ashworth, I do not offer you rescue, nor pity, nor simple convenience. I offer you partnership, built on honesty and mutual respect, exactly as it should have been offered to you the very first time. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Evelyn felt tears gather in her eyes, though for the first time in weeks, they were tears of genuine happiness rather than pain. Yes, she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. Yes, Gideon, I will. He drew her gently into his arms, and for a long, quiet moment, neither of them spoke at all, content simply to stand together on the same terrace where her heart had once been so cruelly broken, now transformed into the place where it had finally, fully healed. Behind them, the ballroom continued its quiet hum of music and conversation, unaware that the very scandal which had brought them together weeks before had finally reached its true and rightful ending. Evelyn Ashworth had walked out of a ballroom in silence once, humiliated and alone. Now she walked back into the world beside a man who had chosen her not out of obligation or convenience, but out of genuine respect for the quiet strength she had shown through every difficult moment since. And this time, when she walked forward into whatever future awaited her, she did not walk alone. A crash of shattering glass echoed through the front hall of the Ashworth estate 3 weeks after the engagement was announced, and Evelyn rushed from the drawing room to find a servant standing frozen beside a broken window, a heavy stone lying among the scattered fragments on the floor. Wrapped around the stone was a single scrap of paper, and when Evelyn knelt to retrieve it with trembling hands, she recognized the hurried, angry handwriting immediately. You have humiliated me for the final time. I will not allow you to enjoy your happiness while I lose everything I have built. There was no signature, but none was needed. Evelyn already knew, with cold certainty, exactly who had thrown the stone. Word reached Gideon within the hour, and he arrived at the Ashworth estate faster than Evelyn had ever seen him travel, his expression a mixture of fury and fear as he examined the broken window and the threatening note still clutched in her hand. He has lost everything, Gideon said grimly, after reading the message twice. His engagement collapsed. His creditors are demanding immediate payment now that his reputation offers no further protection, and society has turned against him completely since the truth came out at Lady Beaumont's gathering. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind of man there is. What do we do? Evelyn asked, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear curling through her chest. We ensure he cannot act on his threats, Gideon said firmly. I will speak with the local magistrate immediately, and I will arrange additional protection for this household until the matter is resolved. Whitmore has already proven he is willing to use cruelty and deception to protect himself. I will not risk your safety by underestimating what desperation might drive him to attempt next. Over the following days, Gideon's steward Henry worked closely with local authorities, gathering evidence of Whitmore's threats alongside the earlier proof of his debts and deceptions. It did not take long to discover that Whitmore had fled London entirely, likely fearing the consequences of both his mounting debts and his reckless threat against Evelyn's household. Reports eventually reached them that he had taken passage on a ship bound for the colonies, hoping to escape his creditors and his ruined reputation by starting over somewhere far beyond the reach of London society. He is gone, Gideon told Evelyn one quiet evening, several days later, as they walked together through the gardens of Ravensworth Hall. Truly gone this time, not simply hiding from his own mistakes as he did before. I do not believe he will trouble either of us again. Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her, though beneath it lingered a quiet sadness for the man Whitmore might have been, had he chosen honesty over deception from the very beginning. I hope he finds some measure of peace, wherever he ends up, she said softly, though I confess I am relieved to know he can no longer threaten our happiness. Our happiness, Gideon repeated, a small, genuine smile touching his features. I find I quite like the sound of that. Evelyn smiled in return, slipping her hand into his as they continued their walk through the peaceful gardens, the autumn leaves drifting gently around them in the cool evening air. So much had changed since that first terrible night when Whitmore had shattered her heart in front of hundreds of witnesses. She had walked out of that ballroom believing her future had been destroyed entirely, only to discover that a quiet, unexpected kindness on a dark and lonely road would ultimately lead her toward a happiness far greater than anything she had imagined possible. Their wedding took place on a bright autumn morning, in the small chapel near Ravensworth Hall, surrounded only by close family and true friends who had stood beside them throughout the entire difficult ordeal. Charlotte served as Evelyn's attendant, tears of genuine joy in her eyes as she watched her closest friend finally find the happiness she so deeply deserved. Margaret and Colonel Ashworth sat proudly in the front pew, their earlier worries about scandal and reputation long since replaced by quiet gratitude for the man their daughter had chosen, and who had chosen her in return. As Evelyn walked down the narrow aisle of the small chapel, she thought once more of that terrible night weeks earlier, of walking away from her broken engagement in complete and dignified silence, unaware that a quiet carriage was already following her into an entirely different future. She had believed, in that painful moment, that her composure was simply a shield against humiliation, a way of protecting whatever pride remained after such a public betrayal. She understood now that it had been something far more important than mere pride. It had been the quiet strength that ultimately drew Gideon to her in the first place, the very quality that had convinced him she deserved far better than the cruelty she had endured, and far more than the ordinary, careful life she might otherwise have settled for. As she reached the front of the chapel and took Gideon's waiting hand, she saw in his eyes the same quiet warmth and steady sincerity she had first noticed on that dark, lonely road weeks before, when he had stepped down from his carriage to offer her assistance she had not asked for, but had desperately needed. "I told you once," Gideon murmured softly, as the small gathering waited for the ceremony to begin, "that I could not stop thinking about the way you walked out of that ballroom in silence." "And I told you," Evelyn whispered back, "that I did not need rescuing." "No," he agreed, his smile warm and genuine. "You never did, but I am endlessly grateful you allowed me to walk beside you regardless." As the small chapel filled with quiet vows and genuine joy, Evelyn Ashworth, soon to become the Duchess of Ravensworth, understood at last that the silence she had carried out of that ballroom weeks before had never been a sign of weakness at all. It had been the quiet foundation of a strength that had carried her through humiliation, through danger, and finally, through an unexpected and deeply genuine love, toward a future far brighter than anything she could have imagined on that dark and lonely night when it had all begun. Outside the chapel, as the newly married couple emerged into the bright autumn sunlight, a familiar black carriage waited at the bottom of the steps, its dark horses stamping gently against the cool morning air. Evelyn smiled as Gideon helped her inside, remembering the very first time that same carriage had followed her through the darkness, offering comfort and safety when she had least expected to find either. This time, as the carriage pulled away from the chapel and carried them both toward the beginning of their new life together, there was no darkness left to follow her through at all. Only quiet, steady sunlight and the certainty of a partnership built not on rescue or convenience, but on genuine respect, honesty, and love freely given between two people who had each, in their own quiet way, learned to trust again.